Hey guys, in today's video, we're going to go over how to install solid panels in our Flex series. This will include how to space your studs, measure for your panels, and install the panels. We offer three different types of solid panels with our Flex series. We offer a vinyl wrap gypsum panel, which is a pre-wrapped gypsum panel that can be cut with a utility knife. We offer a laminate panel, which is a laminate finished particle board that can be cut with a circular saw. And we offer a fabric wrap panel, which is a pre-wrapped panel that can be cut with a very sharp knife. All three panel options come in 4x10 or 4x8 options. All panels will need to be cut to size on site based on the openings that you create. To determine stud spacing for panel width, take a look at the drawing. There are two situations you'll typically see. There will either be studs spaced to fit full 48-inch wide panels with one panel cut on the end, or there will be evenly spaced studs to fit evenly cut panels. The panel width cannot exceed 48 inches. If there are horizontal studs on the wall, the approximate location of the horizontal stud can be found on the drawing. The actual location of the horizontal stud may be dependent on the studs above the door or other horizontals within the space. Ultimately, the installer is going to have control of the stud spacing. In this section of the video, we will go over how to set the stud spacing to fit a 4-foot wide panel. To determine the location of the 4-foot wide panels, take a look at the drawing. In the locations where you see 3 foot 11 and 3/8 listed as the opening dimension, this will be the location of the 4-foot wide panels. The reason the dimension shows 3 foot 11 and 3/8 is because it is the visual opening with the trim installed. Without the trim installed, the 4-foot wide panels will fit. To set the stud spacing for a 4-foot wide panel, we need to have a starting point. This starting point needs to be a flex stud that has been plumbed up and anchored in place. The stud could be coming off a flex post, it could be coming from a door opening, or an existing wall if the existing wall is perfectly plumb. Once we have a flex stud established, we can then set the spacing to fit our 4-foot panel. So in this case, I'll be putting a panel in this location, therefore we'll be moving this flex stud based on the location of this flex stud. The solid panel will rest on this portion of the flex stud. The solid panel will butt into this portion of the flex stud. Therefore, when we go to measure for our 4-foot panel, we'll measure from this point on the flex stud 48 1/8 over to the same point on the opposite side flex stud. The reason why we add the 1/8 of an inch is to give us some room left to right for the solid panel. So I'll take my tape measure and I'll measure from the point discussed. I will move my flex stud over to the 48 1/8 mark and then tighten the set screw to lock the flex stud in place. With the bottom of the opening established, we can now move to the top of the opening and repeat the same process. The other option would be to use a level or a laser level to plumb up this flex stud. Once you've established this flex stud, you can move along to the other flex studs and repeat the same process. Here's an example of installing a 4-foot wide panel in the opening we created. By creating the opening for the panel 48 1/8, it gives us tolerance left or right, which will help when installing the panel. When we install the flex trim, it'll cover the small gap on each side of the panel. Make sure the panel is resting on the inside portion of the flex stud. In a situation where you have evenly cut panels, you simply need to adjust the vertical flex studs to create evenly spaced openings. As a reminder, you cannot exceed the 48-inch width. Once you have the vertical flex studs in place, tighten the set screws at both the top and the bottom to lock the position of the vertical flex studs. Once you have the vertical studs in place, you can then install your horizontal flex studs. Again, this is going to be dependent on the design of your project. Before measuring for the panels, I wanted to go over the measuring points on the framing. I mentioned these measuring points earlier in this video, but I want to go over them in more detail. When measuring for the width of your panels, the measuring point is going to be from this portion of the flex stud over to the same measuring point on the opposite side flex stud. The panels are going to rest on this shelf. This shelf is approximately 1/4 of an inch. Therefore, the panel must be within this shelf in order to fit properly. When the flex trim is installed, it is flush with this shelf of the flex stud. Therefore, in order for the trim to hold the panels in, that panel must be within this portion of the flex stud. On the flex track, when we're measuring for height for some of the panels, the measurement is going to be from this shelf within the flex track. The panel is going to sit on this section of the flex track. So with that in mind, we can now measure for our solid panels. On this wall, there are multiple measuring situations for the solid panels. We'll go over each measuring situation. The one measurement that will be the same for each opening will be the width measurement for the panel. To measure for the width of the panels, we'll measure from our measuring point on our flex stud over to the same point on the opposite side flex stud and subtract 1/8 of an inch. Same as the 48-inch panel, that 1/8 of an inch will give you some tolerance when installing the panels, but also allow the flex trim to hold the panel in place. To measure for the height and the installation of the solid panels, we're going to start with this opening. This opening will be receiving full height panels. There are 2 different measurements based on the type of panel you are using. We're going to start with the measurement for vinyl wrap gypsum panels and fabric panels. To measure for the height, you'll measure from the floor to the bottom edge of the track. We recommend taking a couple measurements within the opening and taking the shortest of the 2 measurements. To install the panel, we're going to place the panel into the flex track on the floor first. We're then going to flex the panel until it clears the top track, and then we're going to relax the panel so that it sits into the ceiling track. Once it's in the ceiling track, the panel is not going to come out. So I'm going to go ahead and install this panel. To measure the height for full height laminate panels, we'll measure from the track shelf and the floor track to the bottom edge of the ceiling track. We'll be adding in 1/2 inch shims to the floor track to sit the panels on. The reason we do this is because the laminate panels do not flex as easy as the gypsum and the fabric panels. By putting the panel on shims, it'll keep the panel into the ceiling track. You can also use this method for the gypsum or fabric panels if you happen to cut them short. I went ahead and placed shims into the floor track on each side of the panel. If you don't have any 1/2 inch shims, the panels are 1/2 inch thick. Therefore, you could use a cut off piece of the panel and place it into the floor track. To install the panel, we're going to go up into the ceiling track, place the panel against the studs, and drop it onto the shims. With the panel installed, it'll be into the ceiling track and into the floor track, therefore the panel will not come out. As mentioned, The full height panels should not come out of the opening because they are in the floor track and the ceiling track. However, a way to temporarily secure the vertical edges of the panel is to use a trim tag. A trim tag is cut off pieces of flex trim. We'll install the flex trim into the studs to hold the panel in place. The reason we would do this is if we wanted to keep moving on and working on other items on the project, or if we had glass coming and we need to temporarily secure the panels until we could install the full height pieces of trim. So I'm going to go ahead and install the tags. The next panel we'll measure for is the panel going within this opening. This panel will run from the floor track up to the horizontal stud. This is something you'll typically see when you have a glass clear story or a gypsum panel above the horizontal flex stud. To measure for the height of this panel, we'll measure from the track shelf up to this point on the flex stud. Now this panel can be fairly tight. However, if you want to give yourself some breathing room, you could take up to 1/8 of an inch off the panel. Again, we want to make sure that flex trim is going to hold that panel in place. When you take your measurements, we recommend taking a couple measurements on each side of the opening in case you have to adjust for the levelness of the floor. With my height measurements, I can now measure for the width of the panel. To install this panel, we'll place the panel into the floor track first and then press the panel against the flex studs. Once in place, we'll use our trim tag to secure the panel. The next panel we'll be measuring for is the panel going within this opening. This panel will run from the horizontal flex stud up into the flex track. To measure for this panel, measure from the bottom edge of the ceiling track to this point on the horizontal flex stud and add a 1/2 inch. Adding the 1/2 inch will allow the panel to go up into the ceiling track and rest on the horizontal flex stud. Once you have your height measurement, take your width measurement. To install this panel, we're going to go up into the ceiling track, press the panel against the studs, and let it rest on the horizontal flex stud. Once in place, secure the panel with a tag. The last panel we'll be measuring for is the panel going in this location. This panel will be surrounded by flex studs on all 4 sides. To measure for the height, we'll measure from this point of the horizontal flex stud up to the same point on this horizontal flex stud. Now this measurement can be fairly tight, or you could take up to 1/8 of an inch off that height measurement. Again, we want to make sure the flex trim is going to hold the panel in place. Once we have our height measurement, we can take our width measurement. To install this panel, we're going to set the panel on the horizontal stud at the bottom and press the panel into the flex studs. Once in place, secure the panel with the trim tags. Before concluding this video, I want to go over a situation you may run into in the field. If you have a situation where the existing walls are out of plumb, or the floor and or the ceiling are out of level, You'll be able to cut those panels on an angle in order to follow the contour of the wall or the floor and the ceiling. The only thing that's important is to make sure that that panel's into the ceiling track or the floor track, and making sure that that trim is going to hold those panels in place. So this will complete the video on how to install solid panels. If you have any questions, please contact our office.